Hey everybody, welcome to Camera Dads episode 3. I am host number 1, Phil, and with me as always is my brother and co-host Simon.
Hey everyone, host number 2, Simon here.
And tonight we also have our very first guest host with us, a good friend of the show and longtime photographer, especially of kids, Ben Hollingsworth.
Howdy, folks. I'm Ben. I'm, like I said, longtime photographer. I have 3 kids, a little older than these other guys. They range from 17 down to 10. I've been shooting all manner of different sports as it relates to the kids over the years. Whether it's what we got: basketball, soccer, track, BMX, skateboarding.
It's a huge variety of sports.
Yeah, huge variety.
Which is exactly the reason that we reached out to you, because you've got you've got quite a bit of experience in doing this. So
yeah, my kids are 5 and 3, play no organized sports, so I shoot them playing frisbee and attempting to throw a football, and not exactly what you're used to, Ben.
Oh, I've spent many hours doing exactly that with my kids too. So that's certainly where I got started.
So,
go ahead, Phil.
All right. So we kind of want to go over tonight is just kind of the huge variety of things that our kids have done in the sports arena, and the challenges and rewards and what have you of trying to take good photos of them.
Yeah, and we figured that other parents, and since this is Camera Dads, other dads might be dealing with some of the same things with their own kids, and they're trying to take photos of their kids, or they want to do a better job of it. And we'll sort of explore some of those issues tonight too, under the context of what we have done to solve those problems in our own lives. So, Phil, where are we all coming from? Phil, what sports do your kids play?
Okay, well, it's interesting. A little bit of background for you and I, actually, the brothers that we are. We didn't grow up playing any sports.
We weren't what you would call athletic individuals.
Our sports, and this is true, consisted of playing kickball and croquet in the backyard while riding unicycles.
Yeah, pretty much. That's
I'd pay to get access to photograph that.
It's on ESPN8, the Ocho.
The Ocho. Thank you, Chuck Norris.
And I think it's good to bring that up because now our kids are maybe a little more into actual sports, and so I'm kind of flying blind here. I don't even know the rules to some of the sports. Like we were trying to play football the other day, and I was like, okay, I'm going to be the quarterback, and it's my job to. And I'd ask my wife, like, what now? So Ben, you might have a little more background in some of this with your personal background and your own kids as well.
I wasn't much farther ahead than you were, actually. I mean, my brothers and I were not athletes growing up, but I do enjoy watching sports, so I at least had that on you.
Okay.
When I got started in this, so my son, he is 7, and he's been playing soccer for about 3 years. I think he's about to start his 4th season, and about to. He actually did start it just a couple of days ago. And I got to say, I still don't know what I'm doing when I'm out there taking pictures of him. So this is outdoor soccer, just through the YMCA, and sorry, lost my train of thought for a sec.
Well, Phil, I was going to ask you, as you're on that train of thought, this isn't a gear show, but what are you using? Are you using your mobile phone? You have DSLR?
Well, for the sports, I sort of default to using the DSLR with a 55 to 200 millimeter zoom lens, which is one of the
it's a pretty standard.
that I have.
Yeah, it's a pretty standard lens that a lot of people might have in their kit.
Yeah, you get that sometimes when you buy a camera. Sometimes they'll throw in that lens as part of the deal. That's how I got it. Okay. I use that lens almost exclusively for sports photography. Although there have been some sports, basketball, for instance, where it doesn't work out so well.
And
Why is that?
What are you using here?
Well, I've got a variety. You know, I started off using I shoot Canon. I started off using their 70 to 300 consumer grade lens, which is on par with the 55 to what 200, 250 that they ship now that Phil said he was using.
Yeah.
Gradually worked up my way up through a couple different lenses. I have now is a 70 to 200 f2.8 IS lens, which I love. And I've been known to rent better lenses than that from time to time.
And that 70 to 200 is kind of well known as one of the standard lenses for portrait photographers and sports photographers. And you said it's an f2.8 lens, right?
That is correct.
And what does that?
They have an f4 variety, but I have the 2.8 version.
So what does that mean? And again, I don't want to get too far from tangent, but the shooting sports with a mobile phone is going to be a much different experience than shooting with a DSLR with one of these lenses. So what does that lens mean when you said it's a 2.8 IS?
Well, IS means image stabilization. There are gyroscopes and stuff inside the lens that help stabilize the picture. So if you're standing there and your hands are shaking and you're kind of wobbling the lens around, which happens more and more with longer lenses, it'll help kind of stabilize things a little bit so you don't get blurred motion from the camera shake.
Okay.
Canon calls it image stabilization IS. Nikon calls it vibration.
VR.
Yeah. Tamron uses that also. Sigma calls it optical stabilization OS. Different acronyms, they all mean the same thing.
And that 2.8, that means it's got a large aperture, and so you can use a faster shutter speed and also take photos in lower light. Is that right?
That is correct. Yeah, the aperture is the size of the opening inside the lens, the diameter of that opening through which the light comes.
Okay.
So the bigger that hole is, it's like passing water through a hose. You got a little tiny drinking straw, would be like your f8, f11. A fire hose is going to be your f. The bigger the opening, the more light you can pass through it.
Okay. And so the reason that we're bringing all this up is if I'm wanting to shoot photos of my kids playing soccer, like Phil's talking about, it sounds like there's a couple different options. I can get a DSLR and one of these 55 to 200 lenses, or one of these 70 to 200 lenses. And are they both going to do a good job? I mean, Phil, in your experience, does this work? The setup you've got?
For the most part, using the 55 to 200 lens works pretty well. It doesn't have as big of an aperture as the one that Ben's talking about, but for the most part, I use it for outdoor, midday soccer games or baseball games. So the amount of light that I have isn't an issue. And it's what I really use it for is the zoom. That's probably the biggest thing for me. I've always kind of been a zoom nut, sometimes to a fault, just zooming in too far and not getting quite what I want. But I'm thinking of, for example, in baseball, I can get up to, from watching a baseball game, I can stand behind the fence but put the camera right up to the chain link fence, zoom out and see my son like full size, filling the frame, standing there on first base, going like this, ready to catch a ball or whatever the thing. And there's no way that I could do that with a lens that didn't have that kind of a zoom on it, unless I was standing out there on the field.
Now, what about if I've got a mobile phone, like an iPhone or an Android, it's got like 12 megapixels and I can pinch to zoom. That's basically doing the same thing though, right?
Well, no, it's not.
And I'm kidding. I know it doesn't do the same thing, but trying to play devil's advocate
here, Simon. No, that's a fair question, because there's a lot of parents that really just rely on their mobile phone for taking pictures of their kids and this kind of thing. And for the most part, those pictures are going to be pretty good. We were talking about image stabilization, and more, the last couple of years, higher end phones have had OIS built in. The iPhone probably 6 or 6 Plus and up has it. A lot of the high-end Samsungs have it. The Google Pixel, I'm sure, has it, and that's becoming more and more of a normal thing. So the vibrations.
So if I'm like holding it in my hands and wobbling around, it's going to stabilize that image.
Yeah.
Okay.
If
To a
you're
point.
Okay, to a point.
yeah. But it's
Yeah,
going
if you're
to take any kind of that
shaking
shake out of there. It's not going to be blurry if it didn't have it. Like if your hand was just shaking a little bit. But yeah, if you're actively just bouncing it around to see what happens, it's not really going to work. The idea behind OIS is that it just helps eliminate what could be a blurry photo when there is a tiny amount of shake going on. But
So
with the zoom, it would take a lot to get into the whole optical zoom versus digital zoom thing. But on a smartphone, you're not doing any actual physical zooming. You're not bringing that subject closer to you through optics. You're just essentially using software to magnify the image you've already got.
sort of like cropping it in Photoshop.
Yeah, it's exactly like
Yes,
cropping.
exactly like cropping it.
So if we look at some of the common challenges that parents face, things like with your mobile phone, the photos are often, they come out blurry, especially if it's an evening soccer football game. Maybe you have a pocket camera, and I know I have a pocket camera, but when I start zooming in, sometimes it's hard to focus. Sometimes weather is a problem. Sometimes the lighting is really bad, especially if it's indoor. How do you guys solve some of these problems that are common to parents shooting photos of sports? Ben, what do you do to solve some of these problems?
Well, you can change what you're shooting. If your equipment is not up to the task of shooting at a great distance in a darker room, like indoor basketball, which is one of the hardest things to shoot, then instead of trying to get that layup at the far end of the court, you can focus on more of the lifestyle shots. Get pictures of the kids celebrating on the bench, or getting ready before the game, or hanging out with their friend after the game. Things that will create memories of the experience, but they don't have nearly the technical challenges of shooting at a great distance in a dark room.
That's a really good point. I think we've been conditioned by ESPN and YouTube replays to look for the highlights. And when you're sitting courtside at your kid's basketball game, we have in our mind this image of capturing the moment he goes up for the layup, and the moment he catches that perfect touchdown pass. But you're exactly right. I mean, if we're creating memories, it's not necessarily about those highlight shots. And those shots typically require thousands of dollars of gear and a trained professional to get. We want to preserve those memories. And so I think this is a great idea to shoot these other things that add texture and context to the game, as opposed to always like thinking we have to get that highlight.
That's something that I'm sort of assuming, but just being a parent myself, thinking that a lot of parents are on that same boat where they don't think about what could I shoot instead. And there's a lot of things that you could shoot instead to get the memories. In any sport, you've got the timeouts, the after game walk down the court where you high five everybody on the other team. Everybody, maybe they're on a break of some kind and everybody's just huddled around the coach, and the coach is, the kids are on their knees and the coach is sort of squatted down saying, listen kids, we got to do this, we got to do this, or the go team, everybody put your hand in. You can tell a lot of stories about the game with those things. But if you're waiting for your son or your daughter to make that perfect shot, what if they don't? Because they're probably not going to.
Yours might not. I mean, mine does every time.
Simon, frisbee isn't a real sport. So
Phil, it's called disc, not frisbee. Come on.
Yeah.
But
even if you look at Sports Illustrated's website where they have their long form articles, they're really about telling stories, and they do have great action shots from that you expect to see from Sports Illustrated, but they tell all the backstory and the preparation and everything that goes into that, and all the rest of that stuff is still something that a lot of everyday parents can do with their smartphone even.
Mm-hmm. That's a good point. And Phil, I think when you're at some of these games with your kids, if I'm remembering right, you usually have the DSLR, and your wife often has a mobile phone. Is that right?
Usually,
like you're shooting pictures,
or we'll trade it, and she'll have the DSLR on her mobile phone.
Okay, but it's sort of like one and the other.
Yeah, yeah.
And then
we sometimes do that too.
Okay. And you get
my wife will record like a video of what's going on for a minute or two, just to kind of get that video going on while I'm focusing on stills with my SLR.
Well, yeah, and that's something that I do too. Is when I'm in that environment where I just want to get some really good pictures, if I don't have my camera set up ahead of time, and the first couple shots, they're blurry or the lighting isn't right or whatever, well, I could take out my cell phone and just have it on auto and get more or less good enough pictures out of it, without having to fiddle with all the buttons and dials on my fancy smanchy DSLR, which can do a great job if I take the time to be prepared.
Well, you mentioned earlier, just now, you said setting up your DSLR. What if you do want to capture that highlight worthy frame of hitting that shot or scoring the basket or whatever it is? Is there a way to do that on just an average camera?
Do
you need like the fanciest gear ever to do that sort of thing?
Let me take a two-pronged approach to this, and I'm going to put the second prong on Ben.
Okay.
My first take here is to get those perfect shots. One thing you have to do, no matter what your equipment, is be in the right position. You have to,
yes.
I picture myself,
point, yeah.
if I want an amazing shot of somebody doing a slam dunk, well, a perspective you're not going to get any other way is if you were laying on the floor underneath the hoop or squatting down right next to there.
You might get a face full of basketball if that.
Yeah, you probably break your phone, but you have to think about how you want that shot to look if that's really what you're going for. Where do I need to position myself on the court? Do I need to step inside a little and hope the coach doesn't get mad at me? There's tons of stuff to think about just to be in the right point, in the right frame to get what you want.
And Ben,
that has nothing to do with the equipment. I'm hoping that Ben can talk more about the techniques and the equipment to handle that.
Well, and
right. I want to continue on that subject you had there, though. The friendlier you get with the coaches and the officials, and even the other players, the more likely, or the more freedom you are going to be given for getting into the positions you want to be in, because they're all going to be like, oh yeah, that's just Micah's dad. He's fine. He takes great pictures. This is fun. Let him be there.
That's it.
Or if you're just that sneaky creep with the camera that nobody knows, you're going to get some ugly looks.
Well, that's a great point. And Simon and I, our dad would be
that's about to say that's my dad.
Close to that creepy guy who doesn't quite ask for permission all the time and just says, "Oh, it'll be all right. I'm going to go take this picture." And it's like, no.
Well, and also
I do that too.
There's a fine line there sometimes, depending on the sport
game,
and the coaches. And
you can also be that guy who tries to maybe get a team photo when the game is done, things like that, to get on the good sides of the parents and the other coaches, and make sure people know it's not just about you and your kid, but you might have some shots of some of the other kids too. And then other parents might be grateful to have those afterwards.
Actually, we'll the entire pictures that I've taken that day of whoever and put them up on my website and email that link out to the other parents on our team.
Yeah, I think that's always
honestly, they're rarely downloaded, but I get comments now and then from people saying, "Oh yeah, those were neat."
I feel you raise a really good point about being in the right position, and that's something that, in my personal experience and just in observing this, I think people don't always do that. just because your camera has a zoom lens, that might change your focal length and your angle of view, but it won't change your perspective necessarily. You need to physically move around, and if you know that that you're shooting a soccer game and your kid is going towards the goal on the north side of the field, then maybe walk over to that side so you can get some pictures of your kids scoring the goal.
Absolutely. If
move around.
If you sit where you parked your butt at the beginning of the game and hope you're going to get good shots of him making that goal, well, guess what? You're going to get good shots of the backside of him making that goal. And but instead, you can go around and just wait, because that photo op may come, it may not, but you be there behind the goal or askew sort of sideways next to the goal or something, and be there, be ready. But
when I go to a soccer game, I take either my camera or my lawn chair, but I never take both, because one of them is not going to get used the entire game.
That's great. I love that.
Ben, you've clearly been doing this for a while. This is great.
Too long.
What about some of the technical things, though? I've hardly spoken much this podcast. I've been asking a lot of questions because I don't shoot my kids playing actual sports just out in the yard. I have the same lens Ben does. I got a 70-200 f2.8 lens. I shoot with both full frame and crop sensor cameras, and there's a lot of technical nitty gritty things that can help someone be a better photographer too. And I bring this back to what Phil mentioned earlier when Phil, you said setting up your DSLR. For me, one of the things I try and do is get to know my camera, know how to change the settings that I want, and know how to make my camera do what I want it to do for a given situation. So what do you guys do to set up your camera or to do some of the more technical things to get the shots that you want?
Well, a lot of it is, just shoot a lot. Become very familiar with the gear that you're using. What's now my second body is a Canon 7D that I have had for 7 years now. And that thing is a natural extension of my hand. If I want something to happen, I don't have to think about, 3 clicks on this wheel and turn the thumb here. I just say, I want a faster shutter speed. And it just happens because my fingers know how to do it, because I've taken, 200,000 photos with that camera. Maybe a slight exaggeration, but not by much.
I would say it's probably about right.
So that's the number one thing. Just become familiar with it. Every sport is going to have widely varying details that you're going to have to work out. Indoor basketball in a junior high gym is going to be very different. Different challenges from shooting peewee soccer on a Sunday afternoon versus wrestling meets, or skateboarding at sunset, or those types of things. Become familiar with the sport so you know before you leave home what to anticipate. Am I going to need my wide and my medium lenses? Am I going to need my medium and my long lenses? How much gear do I need to take? I've developed enough of a collection that I can't take everything anymore. So you just kind of have to know ahead of time, this sport needs this type of thing, this sport needs that type of thing.
Well, that's a good point, because it's hard to sit here as we're recording this and say, here's the solution for if you're shooting curling, or if you're shooting ice hockey, or if you're shooting basketball. There is no one solution, but I think it's exactly right about getting to know your gear and making sure that you're not trying to decide these things on the fly, but you kind of know from a lot of experience how to make your camera do what you want it to do, and you know what gear to bring so you can get the shots you want to get.
Right. Just in general, though, if I was telling somebody, your kids are very athletic, they do everything, a lens will go out to 200 or 300 millimeter is going to get you by for most youth sports. A little on the short side. I have some teleconverters that I can slap on my my 70-200. it'll go out to at least like an 18 millimeter, like most of your wider kit lenses do. The faster aperture you can get, the better. The newer the camera, the better, because there have been some remarkable improvements made in the accuracy and the speed of autofocus within the last 5 years. So if you're using a hand-me-down camera that's 8-9 years old, money today and get a camera that was so much more capable of sports than the one you're using.
Let's talk about autofocus for a second, because that's something that I've struggled with. There are times where there's a series of shots, like my son might be dribbling the basketball down the court, but he's obviously not going to stay in exactly the same plane across, from me. But I want to make sure that I get a couple of really good shots. Or where he's starting, whatever the sport may be, he's starting farther away, but then the run will bring him closer to where I am. So my first couple shots are great, but then the last, because I'm shooting in burst mode to hope I get the best one. But as he comes in to slide on first base, well, those are all blurry because I've been focused on where he was.
Well, so if my answer to that question has to do with a couple different things. First of all, I don't like to give advice on a lot of things in life, but one thing I am confident in saying you should do as a photographer is learn to use what's called back button focus. And most of the time, if you're shooting a normal DSLR, you press the shutter button halfway and your camera focuses. And then you press it all the way and it takes the picture. But back button focus removes the focusing from the picture taking and it puts it on a button on the back side of the camera. And the actual mechanics of setting that up are different for Nikon, Canon, Sony. But if you just do some Googling on like Canon Rebel T6i autofocus, you'll find out how to do it. But what that frees you up to do is you can be focusing regardless of whether you're taking a picture. And then whenever you do take a picture, it snaps it instantly, even if it is not necessarily in focus. But it allows you to use autofocus in such a way that it is continually focusing, and you don't have to kind of hold your finger halfway down the shutter and hope you don't accidentally take a picture. You're just focusing with your thumb on the back. And then when you want to take the picture, you snap the shutter button. But there's also a couple different elements of autofocus where you can have your camera set to autofocus once or autofocus continually. And you can have it set to use just one focusing point or many focusing points. So there's a lot of different ways of doing this. What I like to do is set it on what's called, the Nikon calls it 3D tracking. And so I can focus with my thumb with the back button on my son as he is running around the yard, hold my thumb down on the focus, and no matter where he is in the frame, my camera will continually move that little focusing point around to stay locked on him. And then whenever I want to take a picture, I just snap my index finger and it takes the picture. Sorry, that was kind of a soapbox rant. It's not me. Did not mean to hijack things there, guys.
I do think the back button focus is awesome, and I use it all the time. However, I don't think it's a requirement to solve the problem that Phil was mentioning, because you can leave your index finger depressing that button halfway down, and it will continually focus. If you're on what Canon calls AI servo mode, where it's just a continuous autofocus. So if you have the dexterity to press the button all the way down to take your shot and then let it halfway up again, but still keep it halfway pressed, it will continually focus like that.
Yeah.
What's interesting,
I don't have that dexterity at 46 years old anymore.
No, I don't.
So yeah, that's why I like being able to just hold my thumb button down, and my thumb is always down, it's always focusing, and then I can just snap whenever I feel like catching a moment.
Yeah.
I guess I've just always been accustomed to the single finger approach, and it sounds like if I really want to get better at doing those kinds of things, I really need to explore the continuous autofocus and probably the back button focus too. And to me, I've tried that before. Simon, you have show me back button focus a few times. And it's just sort of this mental roadblock for me because I have always just gone the halfway click, and that's my, that's it. That's just how my hand works. That's how I take pictures.
And Ben's exactly right.
The finger combo, it's sort of like going to a harder level in the video game because you are now using more controls, and I just
never fingers
committed to do that.
For me, the tricky part is what Ben mentioned, where after you take a picture, if you're using the traditional focusing method of the shutter button, it's releasing it just barely enough so that it continues to focus. And I don't have that kind of dexterity either, which is why I like to use the two separate buttons. And I don't want to generalize here, but when I pick up someone else's camera, if they hand it to me to take a picture of their kids or something, it's typically not on continuous focus. It's often on single focus. And what that means is if I press the shutter button halfway to focus, my camera will light up and it'll go beep, beep. And that means everything is in focus, which is fine until something moves. And if everyone's standing still and we're taking a portrait by the Christmas tree or something, that's fine. But if I hear that little beep, beep, and the viewfinder flashes and everything's in focus, and my kid is running down the football field, he's gonna be out of focus really fast. And so the Nikon terminology is AFC, and Ben, you called it AI servo. Is that right?
Yeah. Canon has 3 different modes. There's a single shot, there's AI servo, and there's another one that I don't think anybody ever uses. I don't remember what it's called.
And my suggestion to a parent out there who's trying to get better photos of their kids playing sports is to learn to use that AI servo mode or the continuous autofocus mode. So as long as your finger is half pressed on the shutter, or if you're pressed on the back button to focus, it is continually refocusing your lens to make sure your kid is in focus. That way, whenever you do press the button to take a picture, it's in focus. That's my soapbox on that.
All right. One thing that I've heard all of us say a lot is learn to do this, learn to do that, get comfortable with such and such. Well, how? How can I just learn what continuous autofocus does and how I should use that? And to partly answer that, I can say, well, you can go on YouTube, and there are some fantastic YouTubers out there who just teach you how to use your camera, and you can learn what it does, how the buttons work, what the mode actually is. You can get as technical as you want to really understand, okay, I get the terminology, but what is it that I'm actually doing here that's really making the difference? And the more time you spend on YouTube or on digital photography school, Simon, perhaps.
I highly recommend that site.
You can learn as much as you want.
You can learn more than you want there. And one thing I would interject here is don't try to learn everything about your camera, because there's a lot I don't need to know, and very few people do know all of it. But figure out what's holding you back. Find the problem that's most annoying to you and figure out how to solve that. And once you've solved that, find what's next most annoying and solve that.
And I would even add, find someone like Ben who's at the sidelines taking pictures and strike up a conversation. But if you have to be curious about it. Don't strike up a conversation about gear and like, well, did you get the newest 5D Mark IV? Boy, you're shooting with the 5D Mark III. That's pretty old. Just ask genuinely curious questions about how they're getting these shots. And most photographers would be glad to show you, because photographers like to talk about photography.
Yeah. You got more than a couple of minutes though before you open that can of worms.
Yeah. I do want to bring up gear. We're at 33 minutes into the show, and we haven't talked about gear much. The lens that you mentioned earlier, Phil, the 55 to 250 or to 200, that you would think, because it goes wider, 55 you would think that it's actually more versatile than the one that Ben and I use, which is a 70-200. But one of the trade-offs with that lens is the aperture is smaller. And Ben used that water hose analogy earlier, where with a smaller aperture, you're going to need a more light to take a shot or a faster shutter speed to take a shot. And I would say if you are wanting to do something to, if you find that your gear is limiting, particularly like if you have an older camera and you find that it's really grainy at higher ISO, so you can't take indoor photos very well, there does come a time when it might help to get new gear. And a friend of mine, actually my brother-in-law, just wanted to just upgraded some gear. He got a 70-200 lens, but he got a used lens from a place online called Adorama, and I think he paid $700, and it's a Sigma branded lens, but it's a 70-200 f2.8. So it's one of these really nice, really fast wide aperture lenses. And it's not the most current version, but it works great for him. And he got it for a lot less than something brand new. And I think he has like a 30-day warranty or something like that through this reputable online dealer. But I would say if a parent out there is struggling to get the pictures and it's just not working out, there are ways of upgrading your gear without spending too much money that can really benefit your photos.
Let me ask a question there, more directed towards Ben. You can rent lenses.
Mm-hmm.
What is the sort of price trade-off as far as, buying a used lens that hopefully will do the job for me and that I'll use for years and years versus, well, my son is starting this new sport and I've heard that this lens might be okay, so I'm going to rent one for, I don't know, how long do you rent lenses for? What do they cost? Is that even viable in what we're talking about here as far as, everyday parents photographing their kids at sports?
In that environment, I would say a rental would be used more for, well, two situations. Either A, your kid made it to the state tournament. This is kind of a one weekend thing you're going to use this lens for, probably not going to use it again. Or number two, you're curious if a certain lens is going to work well for you and you want to try it out. I rent lenses from time to time, mainly for wildlife photography. My daughter and I do a big annual trip every year. And able to experiment with different lenses. I might get a lens of this class someday. There's a few out there. I'll try this one this weekend, this one next weekend, that one the next weekend. And, it's a little more expensive, but compared with buying a lens, deciding you don't like it, returning it, or trying to sell it used at a loss, renting it isn't such a bad deal. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of when you can use it. As far as the costs, it depends on whether you're able to rent it from a local camera store versus one of the online rental places. And there are a good number of online places that rent. Lens.com is my personal favorite.
What was that again?
Lensrentals.com.
Okay.
But I mean, there are a few good ones out there, but for reasons I won't go into right now, I'm partial to them.
Awesome. One more thing about gear.
Hold on.
If you have something else, Ben?
Yeah, I want to hear what you were going to say earlier.
If you're renting it locally, for those of us here in Lincoln, Rockbrook Camera rents, you can get a lens for just a 24-hour rental, which is pretty cheap. If you just want to shoot the big game tonight, you can go out, rent it for 24 hours. It's dollars or depending on the lens you want. You return it the next day, and you're not out all that much. A mail order lens, you're probably getting it for at least 3 days. There's shipping costs that are bundled into that, so it's quite a bit more expensive, but you have a huge selection if you do it that way.
Is there anything you might
think about
say,
for
Ben,
rentals?
Ben, just about gear in general, about when you might want to upgrade gear, how to know which gear to upgrade to, or things like that?
Yeah, I kind of touched on it earlier. Figure out what your most annoying problem is. Solve that problem. I don't upgrade cameras, lenses, just because, hey, there's something new and better. I upgrade cameras when I'm bumping up against a technological limitation of my current gear that's holding me back. I had my Canon 7D for 6 years before I upgraded to the 7D Mark II because, the autofocus and the ISO sensitivity just my head against that in the shooting environments I was in. So yeah, don't buy something just because it's the newest, hottest thing. Find what will solve the problems that are holding you back, and buy lenses that will do that. Don't be afraid to buy used or refurbished lenses either.
Yeah.
Or cameras. I say lenses because I buy a lot more lenses than cameras. But yeah, I've
that's
got
probably something
somewhere
nobody
north
thinks about is
yeah,
doing.
I've got somewhere north of 30 lenses and
Holy
3 camera
cow.
bodies, and almost none of it has been purchased new.
Man.
I bet your
There's
average camera dad out there has no idea that you can rent or purchase used lenses, maybe used cameras, but
Oh yeah.
used
Yeah,
lenses is
buying used lenses, you got to be careful because you want to know how it's been used. I only buy used lenses from individuals if I know the individual and I know how the lens has been used, cared for.
okay.
I will buy a used lens from somebody like Adorama or a used rental from somebody like rentals.com because I know that they have the technical expertise to go through it, make sure it's in good working order before they'll turn around and sell it to me.
Sure.
I would be very careful about buying used equipment just off of some stranger on Craigslist, though, because you just never know.
We did that. We just a week ago, my brother-in-law and I went. We were going to buy a lens off, or he was going to buy a lens off Craigslist. We went down, and the lens that she had in hand was not the lens that was on the Craigslist ad, and we just got a really fishy feeling about the whole thing. So we just backed out, and I've never bought I bought used from Adorama, but I would tend to say the same thing. Unless you really know the person, maybe don't go to Craigslist or Facebook. You just never know. Phil, anything else to say before we wrap this episode up?
I had one other quick thing I wanted to mention on gear, and then we do have a listener question I'd like to get in.
Okay.
Would you guys recommend using a tripod for some of these sporting situations? And which situations, yes or no?
So here's what I'd recommend.
No.
And let Ben also answer this. If you want to use a tripod, use a monopod. I would not recommend a tripod. I would recommend getting a lens with good vibration reduction, or IS, as Canon calls it, because you're going to find yourself running around a lot, and you do not want to be getting in people's way with their tripod and trying to set that thing up. The whole point of the tripod is to steady your camera, but the tripod will not steady the players on the field. So if you can solve the steadying of the camera problem with image stabilization or getting a faster lens, like an f2.8 or even an f4 lens, which is still faster than like an f5.6 lens, then solve that problem. But don't use a tripod. And if you really have to use a tripod, get a monopod, because it's much more portable and less in your way than a tripod. But anyway, Ben, what would you say?
Yeah, when you get into the older kids with more organized sports, you will not be allowed to use a tripod near the field. A monopod can be usable if you've got a lens that's so big and heavy that you just can't handhold it a lot. If you're shooting high school football with a 400 millimeter f2.8 lens,
Awesome.
That's difficult to handhold.
You're probably
a week and a
not,
half ago,
not
it's a beast
looking
of
at
a
camera
lens.
dads either if you've got that kind of equipment at the ready.
Yeah, but otherwise, even a monopod. The first football game I shot, I took a monopod with me, and it stayed attached to my bag the entire time. You're moving too much, and very few people will need extra support. Very few of us people are going to need that extra support for the types of lenses we're going to be using, especially if you're shooting youth sports. Stabilization, honestly, isn't going to help you all that much, because if you're shooting in low enough light that you really need image stabilization to help steady things, then your subject matter is going to be blurry anyway. The one situation where image stabilization will help you is on your really long lenses, your 300 millimeter and up. It'll stabilize the viewfinder too, and that's nice because you can be looking at, the quarterback halfway down the field, and he's not just dancing all over in the viewfinder. You can actually tell what you're aiming at before you freeze the frame with your fast shutter speed.
All right,
Phil.
So that definitely helps with the tripod question. Generally, no. We've got one listener question I want to get to quick. This comes from Dennis, and he says, I don't have much need for sports photography ideas at this point, but what sports photography techniques would help with pet photography or candid pictures of young children? I would imagine dealing with many of the same issues of movement and fast camera shutter, etc. So the pet one is interesting. Dogs catching Frisbee with your son, Simon, maybe, but you don't have a dog. So Ben, you had some thoughts on this for Dennis.
Yeah, I mean, a golden retriever bears a striking resemblance to a 4-year-old, both speed and obedience. So, the first thing you want to do for these shorter subjects like dogs or whatnot, you want to get down on their level. You want to get down on your knees so you're not shooting down at the top of their head all the time. And I mean, that's just general photography tips, whether they're moving fast or sitting there on the couch. But
that doesn't matter whether
you try to do that with
or camera phone. That's just where you want to be.
Yeah,
right?
I mean, that's a composition tip that will just make your photos better. You get down on your knees when you're trying to take pictures of a dog, the dog's going to run straight at you. So unless that's the type of shot you're wanting to get, get a helper to interact with the dog. So throwing the balls or whatever to the dog, help keep the dog distracted, and he won't just be running straight at you all the time. Generally aren't going to be doing that. So you can just get down on their level and shoot wherever you want. Another technique that you really want to do is pay attention to backgrounds. A lot of people focus in on the action of whoever's moving. They get hung up on that. And they get great action shots like that, but right behind the kid is, a busy street in a commercial complex, and, compositionally, you can hardly pick the kid out of the background. So try to position so that on the other side of the kid or the dog is, a smoother, more pleasing background, whether it's just the side of a garage or a bank of trees or a fence or something like that that's not going to compete for the viewer's eye. You also want to pay attention to where the light's coming from. If the sun is on the far side of your subject's going to be silhouetted all the time. You're not going to see any detail. You're not going to see the kid's face. So ideally, you want the sun to be kind of over your shoulder, because that'll give you a nice light, or even off to the side 90 degrees. That'll give you a really nice light on whoever you're shooting. Now, sometimes you just can't make all those things work together, but you do the best you can.
Yeah.
One thing I would say to Dennis is get if it's young children, you can most likely keep up with them a little easier. I would recommend a wider angle, fast prime lens. If you're shooting Nikon makes a really good 35 millimeter f1.8 prime lens. Canon makes a 24 millimeter f2.8 lens. I believe they make a 40 millimeter f2.8 lens. I'm not sure. But if your photo is, if it's not sharp, if it's not in focus, you can't really fix that in post. So I would say do what you need to do to get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the action. And so if your dog is running around, you need a fast shutter speed. If your kid's running around, you need a fast shutter speed. And you can shoot at a higher ISO to get a faster shutter speed. And that's okay. Most cameras today are pretty good at higher ISOs. But if you have to shoot at a slower shutter speed, like a 40th of a second, to get the photo, your kid's going to be blurry. So because you have the luxury of being able to move around with your kid, I would recommend one of these faster primes. If your kid's playing sports and you have a great deal of distance between you and your kid, a prime lens isn't going to help that much, because you need to zoom in a little bit sometimes. But that's what I'd say to Dennis. Get yourself a faster prime lens, and you'll find yourself getting faster shutter speeds and a lot clearer photos, because they're going to be more in focus and not blurry because of the faster shutter speeds.
There's a learning curve to using a prime lens, especially if it's shooting random action like a kid in the backyard.
Mhm.
You got to learn to zoom with your feet, as they say. But the reason Simon tied prime lenses in with this wide aperture is because it's a whole lot cheaper to build a prime lens with a wide aperture than it is to build a zoom lens with a wide aperture. So, I mean, you can get a 50 millimeter f1.8 lens, costs like $100 new. But you try to buy a zoom lens with a 1.8 aperture, you're going to be spending $1,000.
Yeah.
So
That's
there's a trade-off to
something-
be made there.
Yeah. That's probably not the kind of thing that our listeners are going to be really geared, going towards.
Oh man, Phil.
Yeah. I mean, that's just out of reach for a lot of people. The $100 lens is probably something that we could do, but those are some good tips, and I think I hope
Thanks,
you're able to
Dennis.
help Dennis with something there. So thanks for sending in your question.
Well, guys, I think that about does it for this show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me
Cool.
on, guys. It was a
Yeah,
lot of
thanks,
fun,
Ben.
and
Hope
enjoy
to have you-
trying to help out some people.
Yeah, hope to have you back sometime. And our next show is we're going to be talking about social media. So Phil and I are going to be talking about our approaches to sharing photos on social media, where we draw the line in terms of what we share, what we don't share, just some general practices that we do personally and things that we've learned over the years when it comes to putting photos of your kids and your family on social media or not putting them on social media. So that's our topic for next time. If you have feedback, send it to cameradads@gmail.com. You can always check us out on the website, cameradads.com. Phil, anything else?
We have a Twitter. It doesn't work. It's @CameraDads. Hopefully I'll get that active here sooner or later. But yeah, that's there too. You hit everything. So Ben, thank you again for coming on the show. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Ben.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
All right.
Agreed.
Thanks, guys.
All right.